Before I say anything else, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel, because what is happening underneath southern Italy is not a story you want to catch halfway through, and I am going to be following it close lie in the days ahead. There is a place near the city of Naples where the ground itself is rising, slowly, quietly, a little more every single month, and the scientists who have spent their whole lives studying it are now using words they do not use lightly. This is not a mountain in the W. You picture a volcano. There is no towering peak here, and that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why one of the most watched pieces of ground on Earth just crossed a line that experts have been warning about for years. The volcano is called Campi Flegrei. The name means the burning fields, and it sits just to the west of Naples, wrapped around a wide bay, tucked beneath towns and neighborhoods where hundreds of thousands of people live their normal lives every day. Most people who visit this part of Italy never realize they are standing inside a volcano. There is no cone. Here is no crater you can point to on the horizon. Instead, there's a vast bowl in the earth, about 12 to 14 kilometers across, that formed when enormous eruptions in the ancient past caused the ground to collapse inward. This kind of feature is called a caldera, and Campi Flegrei is not just any caldera. It is one of the largest and most active in all of Europe. To understand why the current activity matters so much, you have to understand what this volcano has done before. Roughly 39,000 years ago, Campi Flegrei produced one of the most powerful eruptions this continent has seen in the last 100,000 years. Scientists call it the Campanian ignimbrite eruption. It threw huge volumes of ash and rock into the atmosphere, spread material across a large part of the Mediterranean region, and released so much gas and debris that many researchers believe it affected the climate for a period afterward. Then, around 15,000 years ago, it erupted again in another major event that shaped much of the landscape you can see there today. These were not small events. These were the kind of eruptions that reshaped the map. Now here is the part that most people do not know. Campi Flegrei is not sleeping. It has never fully gone quiet. And the thing it does, the behavior that makes it so unusual, is something called radicalism. That word simply describes the slow rising and falling of the ground caused by movement of fluids and pressure deep below the surface. In most places on Earth, the ground beneath your feet feels permanent and unchanging. At Campi Flegrei, the ground literally breathes. It lifts up over years, then sometimes settles back down. And when it lifts, it does not do so silently. It brings earthquakes with it. The modern chapter of this story really began in the 1960s and 1970s. During that time, the town of Pozzuoli, which sits right in the heart of the caldera, saw its ground rise dramatically. The uplift was so severe that the harbor floor rose, boats could no longer dock in places they always had, and parts of the old town had to be evacuated because buildings were being damaged by the shifting earth. Then, in the 1980s, another strong episode struck. Over a relatively short period, the ground in Pozzuoli rose by well over a meter, accompanied by thousands of earthquakes. Tens of thousands of people were moved out of the historic center. Homes cracked, streets buckled, and then, as it had before, the uplift slowed and the crisis eased. But the volcano never reset. It never went back to sleep in the way people hoped. Since roughly 2005, Campi Flegrei entered a new phase of slow, steady uplift, and this phase has not stopped. Year after year, the ground has continued to rise. The monitoring center that watches this volcano, run by ITAL's National Institute for Geophysics and Volcanology, tracks the movement of the ground down to fractions of a centimeter. And what they have recorded over the last 2 decades is a clear, sustained climb. The center of the caldera, right around Pozzuoli, has risen by a substantial amount in total since this phase began. That may not sound like much when you break it down month by month, but think about what it means for solid ground, holding entire towns, to keep pushing upward without stopping. Every centimeter of rise is a sign that pressure below is not releasing. It is building. And here's why the recent activity has scientists so concerned. It is not only that the ground is rising, it is that the earthquakes have been increasing, both in how often they happen and in how strong they are. For a long time, the seismic activity here was made up of very small tremors, the kind that instruments detect but people rarely feel. But in recent times, the region has experienced some of the strongest earthquakes recorded in this modern uplift phase. Residents of Pozzuoli and nearby areas have felt their homes shake. Some of these tremors have been strong enough to send people into the streets in the middle of the night. Schools have been checked for damage. Emergency plans that were written years ago and left on shelves have suddenly become very relevant again. Let me explain what is actually happening underground, because this is where it becomes clear why experts watch this place so carefully. Beneath Campi Flegrei, there is a system of magma, molten rock, sitting at depth. Some studies should place a large reservoir of it several kilometers down, while smaller pockets may sit closer to the surface. Above that magma, there is a layer of rock and a system of underground fluids, water and gas, heated by the volcano. When the magma releases gases, or when heat pushes those underground fluids upward, the pressure in the shallow crust eases. That pressure does two things. It pushes the ground upward, which is the uplift we see, and it stresses the rock, which produces earthquakes. So the rising ground and the growing number of quakes are two symptoms of the same underlying cause, which is increasing pressure in the shallow part of the volcanic system. Think of it a bit like a bottle of soda that has been shaken. The liquid at the bottom is the magma. The gas trying to escape from it is the pressure, and the cap on the bottle is the layer of solid rock at the surface holding everything in place. As long as the cap stays sealed and strong, the pressure just builds inside. You can even see the sides of the bottle bulge outward slightly, which is like the ground rising. The danger comes if that cap is suddenly removed, or if it becomes so weak that it cannot hold the pressure any longer. Then everything that was held back is released at once. Now, real volcano. As are far more complicated than a soda bottle, and this comparison is not perfect, but it captures the basic tension at the heart of what is happening. Pressure is accumulating below a seal, and the central question is how strong that seal really is and how much more it can take. There's one more layer to this that makes Campi Flegrei different from the classic image of a volcano. Because there is no single narrow vent, no one pipe leading straight down to the magma, the pressure is spread across a wide area. This is part of why the whole floor of the caldera rises together rather than just one spot. It also means that if an eruption did occur, it would not necessarily happen where anyone expects. New vents have opened in different places across the caldera throughout its history. The ground that lifts today across a broad region is a reminder that the entire caldera floor is part of one connected, restless system, not a single predictable point. The critical question that scientists are trying to answer is this. Is the current pressure being driven mostly by hot fluids and gas, or is it a sign that fresh magma is moving upward toward the surface? This distinction matters enormously. If the activity is driven mainly by gas and heated water, the most likely outcome is continued unrest, more earthquakes, more ground movement, and possibly a smaller steam-driven explosion, but not necessarily a large eruption. But if fresh magma is rising and getting closer to the surface, then the risk profile changes completely. And the honest truth, the thing responsible scientists will tell you, is that separating these two possibilities is extremely difficult. The signals overlap. That uncertainty is a large part of why this situation is treated so seriously. There's another factor here that makes Campi Flegrei especially worrying, and it has to do with the rock itself. Research published in recent years has shown that the crust in the caldera, the layer of rock that has to hold back the pressure below, may be weakening over time. Every episode of stretching and cracking, every cycle of uplift, can make the rock less able to be, and without breaking. Think of it like bending a piece of metal back and forth. The first bends are easy and the metal springs back, but repeat it enough times and the metal weakens, until eventually it snaps. Some researchers are concerned that the crust above Campi Flegrei has been through so many cycles of stress that it is approaching a point where it could fracture more easily than it would have in the past. A weaker crust means that even without a dramatic surge of new magma, the ground could reach a breaking point more suddenly than expected. Now, I want to be very clear and very honest with you, because that is the only way I will ever do this. The presence of unrest does not mean an eruption is guaranteed, and it certainly does not mean one is happening tomorrow. Campi Flegrei has gone through episodes of uplift and earthquakes before in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and each of those episodes eventually calmed down without a major eruption. It is entirely possible that the current phase also slows and settles. Volcanoes are not machines with predictable timers. They can build toward a crisis and then quiet down. No one who is being truthful with you can stand here and promise an eruption is coming. What they can tell you, and what the data clearly shows, is that the pressure has been building for 2 decades. The earthquakes are getting stronger, and the system is more active now than it has been in a very long time. That combination is exactly why the alert level for this volcano was raised, and why authorities have been reviewing and updating evacuation plans for the surrounding population. And that population is the heart of why this matters so much. This is not a remote volcano in an empty wilderness. The caldera and the areas immediately around it are home to a very large number of people. The wider Naples metropolitan region is one of the most densely populated areas in all of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people live directly within or very close to the zones that would be most affected by a significant eruption or by a strong burst of earthquakes. Evacuating that many people quickly through crowded roads in a real emergency is one of the hardest challenges any civil protection agency can face. This is why the authorities take the drills so seriously, and why the updates to the emergency plans are not just paperwork. They're trying to solve a problem that has very few easy answers. Let me walk you through what the different possible outcomes actually look like, because understanding the range of scenarios helps you see why the science is so cautious. The mildest outcome, and in many ways the most likely in the near term, is simply continued unrest. The ground keeps rising slowly, earthquakes come in swarms, people feel tremors, buildings need to be inspected, and life goes on under a cloud of ongoing concern, but without a catastrophic event. A more serious step up from that would be a phreatic explosion. That is a steam-driven blast that happens when superheated water underground suddenly flashes into steam and bursts out. These events can be violent and dangerous locally, especially for anyone nearby, but they are not the same as a FU, magmatic eruption. Then, at the far end of the range, there is the possibility of an actual magmatic eruption, where new molten rock reaches the surface. Even here, there is a wide range, from a relatively small eruption up to something much larger. The largest scenarios are thankfully considered less likely in the short term, but they cannot be completely dismissed, and that is precisely why this volcano is monitored more intensely than almost any other on the planet. The monitoring itself is genuinely impressive, and it is worth understanding, because it is the reason we know as much as we do. The scientists watching Campi Flegrei use a whole network of instruments. They have satellite-based measurements that track the ground moving up and down with extraordinary precision. They have seismometers scattered across the region that record even the tiniest earthquakes and pinpoint exactly where they are happening and how deep. They measure the gases coming out of the ground, especially at a famous area called the Solfatara, a shallow crater within the caldera that constantly steams and vents sulfurous gas. Changes in the amount and composition of those gases can offer clues about what the magma below is doing. They monitor the temperature of the ground and the fluids, and they combine all of this into a picture that gets updated constantly. When you hear that scientists have raised concerns, it is not a guess. It is the result of all these instruments pointing in the same direction at once. One of the most telling signals in recent times has been the behavior of the earthquakes themselves. It is not just that there are more of them, it is where they are happening and how deep. When earthquakes cluster at shallow depths and grow in strength, it tells scientists that the stress is concentrating near the surface, in the part of the crust that would have to give way for anything dramatic to happen. Some of the recent seismic swarms have included the strongest tremors measured since this modern phase of unrest began. For the people living there, these are no longer abstract numbers on a screen. They are the sound of their windows rattling and the feeling of their beds shaking in the dark. That lived reality is part of why local anxiety has risen sharply and why the topic has moved from scientific journals into everyday conversation across the region. The Solfatara crater deserves special attention here, because it is one of the clearest windows into the mood of this volcano. If you stand at the Solfatara, you will see steam pouring out of the ground. You will smell the sharp scent of sulfur, and you will feel heat radiating from vents in the earth. This has been happening for a very long time, and for centuries people have come to see it as a natural wonder. But to a scientist, the Solfatara is a diagnostic tool. The amount of gas escaping there and the exact mix of gases tells a story about the magma below. When the volume of gas rises, and when the chemistry of that gas shifts toward types that come more directly from deep magma rather than from surface water, it can be a sign that the deeper system is becoming more active. In recent years, researchers have documented significant increases in the amount of gas being released from the system, with very large quantities of carbon dioxide venting from the ground. That degassing is one more piece of evidence that the volcano is in an active, not a dormant, state. Now think about what that gas does when it cannot escape freely. If pathways to the surface become blocked, the gas builds up pressure underground, pushing the ground higher, and kings and emirs, who told him they'd rather invest directly in the United States than pay a toll. So he dropped the fee entirely and replaced it with what he's calling massive trade and investment deals. From Gulf states into the U.S. economy. He argued this is actually the better outcome, pointing out that America already receives more foreign direct investment than any country in history, and that these new deals will push that number even higher, bringing factories, plants, and equipment into the U.S., and creating what he described as millions of additional high-paying American jobs. Some critics have pointed to that reversal as evidence of an administration making policy on the fly, floating a number one day and abandoning it the next under pressure. That's a fair read of the sequence of events, and it's worth acknowledging rather than waving away. But there's another way to look at the same 24 hours that's just as consistent with the facts. Trump proposed a toll, Gulf leaders immediately countered. With a bigger, more durable offer, and Trump took the better deal. Whether you read that as strategic flexibility or as an idea that didn't survive first contact with reality probably depends on how you already feel about the administration. What's not really in dispute is the outcome. Billions of dollars in additional Gulf investment into the American economy, on top of an already record-setting baseline of foreign investment, secured in less time than it takes most administrations to schedule a meeting about a policy proposal. Then Trump closed the post with a line that's worth sitting with carefully. He said the days of Iran killing hundreds of thousands of people, including 52,000 protesters, are over. Now, to be clear about what that number actually is, well, that's Trump's own figure, stated in his own post. It hasn't been independently verified by outside human rights monitors or a neutral international body, so treat it as high, S-claim, not a confirmed statistic. What is independently documented is that the broader 2026 conflict, dating back to the February 28th strikes, has resulted in a genuinely enormous human toll across the region, with thousands of deaths concentrated in Iran and Lebanon. Whatever the precise number turns out to be, the underlying point Trump is making, that the Iranian regime has a documented brutal history of violently suppressing its own protesters, is not in dispute. That distinction matters for how you should read the rest of this post, and honestly for how you should read most of what comes out of any political figure's social media account during an active war. Governments involved in a conflict, on every side of every war in history, have an incentive to cite the largest defensible number when it makes their opponent look bad, and the smallest defensible number when it's their own actions being scrutinized. That doesn't automatically make a specific figure false. It just means a number sourced to one interested party, without independent corroboration, belongs in a different category than a number confirmed by a neutral third party like the UN or an established human rights organization. Treat Trump's 52,000 figure the same way you'd treat any single-source casualty claim from any government during any war. Plausible, consistent with the broader pattern of what we know about the regime's crackdowns, but not yet an independently confirmed number. Then Trump ended the post the way he ends most of these, with the bottom line. Iran, he said, will never have a nuclear weapon. Now here's the piece of this story that's really gotten people talking today. And it's the reason for the title of this video. Someone dug up an old magazine interview. This is real. It's been fact-checked. It's from 1988, nearly 40 years ago, in which a much younger Donald Trump, years before he ever ran for office, was a sked about Iran. And here's exactly what he said back then. I'd be harsh on Iran. They've been beating us psychologically, making us look a bunch of fools. One bullet shot at one of our men or ships, and I'd do a number on Karg Island. I'd go in and take it. Iran can't even beat Iraq, yet they push the United States around. Read that again. 1988. Karg Island is Iran's most important oil export terminal, the artery through which the vast majority of its crude has historically flowed. Trump was talking about it as a strategic pressure point on Iran almost 4 decades before any of this CSC, that is, current conflict began. And this morning, Trump himself reposted that old quote on his own Truth Social account. He didn't have to do that. Nobody made him dig that up. He chose to put it back in front of millions of people today. On the same morning, he's talking about Iraq, about Iran's collapsed military capacity, and about a naval blockade tightening around Tehran. This isn't even the first time that quote has resurfaced during this war. Back in March, when U.S. forces first struck military targets on Karg Island, that same 1988 interview started circulating widely, and people at the time asked the obvious question, did Trump somehow predict this decades in advance? The honest answer is no. Now, he wasn't forecasting the future. He was simply stating a hawkish, retaliatory view as a private citizen during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a period when Iran really was attacking shipping throughout the Persian Gulf. But the fact that his instinct on Iran policy has apparently been consistent for close to 40 years is still notable, and it's clearly something Trump himself wants people to notice, given that he's now resurfaced the quote a second time. Why would he do that today, of all days? Because the memorandum of understanding that briefly paused this war back in June is dead. Trump has said as much directly, stuck that the agreement was, in effect, a test of whether Iran was negotiating in good faith, and that Iran failed that test. The ceasefire is over. Strikes are and going. And now the president is publicly resurfacing a decades-old statement about seizing one of Iran's most critical pieces of economic infrastructure. That is not something Trump has announced as an active military plan. To be clear, nobody in the administration has confirmed an operation to actually take and hold Karg Island. But the timing of that repost, on a morning already full of blockade news and Iraq withdrawal talk, is the kind of signal Trump has used before to apply pressure without saying so directly. Whether it turns into an actual operation is something we'll only know by watching what happens next, not by reading tea leaves today.